I, 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 I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and burned that. Man, the way that I live don't concern that. Man, we gon' have to settle this another way. A letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and burned that. Man, the way that I live don't concern that. Man, we gon' have to settle this another way.
My name is Tim. This is Sankara right here. And right now this event is one of our Black Male Initiative community nights, which we have once a month. It's also co-sponsored by the DC Metro Coalition to Free the Cuban Five. And just so you know a bit about the Black Male Initiative, it's a program we have here at the University of Maryland at the Namuru Cultural Center, aimed specifically at increasing the retention rate of black males on campus. It's also a place where brothers come together to politic, to network, and to build. And we have these community nights once a month to provide a service to the community, to have esteemed panelists like the brother sitting at the table in front of you right now, just enlighten the campus community and the wider community about a range of issues regarding politics, international social justice issues, and issues of that nature. So tonight, some of the topics we're going to be discussing are the U.S. blockade on Cuba. Also, we're going to be discussing, for any students that are interested in Cuba's free, yes, and I mean free medical program that it's been offering specifically and especially to African students living in the U.S., as well as, obviously, who the Cuban Five are, why they're in prison here in the U.S., and what their story is, since I'm sure many of you, as I was only recently, are perhaps unfamiliar with who the Cuban Five are and what their story is. So, to explain to you a bit more about those issues, we have the panelists sitting in front of you right now, who include Jose Pertierra, who is an attorney practicing law in the District of Columbia. He specializes in international as well as immigration law. He holds a master's degree in philosophy from Georgetown, as well as a Juris Doctor from George Washington University. His clients have included Elian Gonzalez, Jennifer Harbury, Sister Diana Ortiz, and the government of Venezuela, which he currently represents in several federal district court cases, as well as in the extradition request that Venezuela made for the purpose of trying the terrorist Luis Posada Carilles for murder in Caracas. Mr. Pertierra is Cuban. We also have with us today Brian Becker, who is the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Answer Coalition, it is an acronym for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. This group is an umbrella group that consists of many anti-war and civil rights organizations and was formed in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And ever since its founding, the Answer Coalition has helped to organize many of the largest anti-war demonstrations in the United States, including demonstrations of hundreds of thousands against the Iraq War. The group has also organized activities around a variety of other issues, ranging from the Israel-Palestine debate, to immigrant rights, to social security, to the extradition of Luis Posada Carilles, who I mentioned earlier. And for those of you who don't know who that is, he's a Cuban-born Venezuelan anti-communist extremist and former CIA agent who was involved with bombing a Cuban airliner, killing over 70 people. Also with us today we have Kurt Schmoke, who is the Vice President and General Counselor and former Dean of Howard University Law School. He was the first elected African-American mayor of Baltimore, which was in 1987. And he was also part of the White House domestic policy staff during the Carter administration before returning to Baltimore as Assistant United States Attorney in 1978. He is also known for his opposition to the war on drugs, which for those BMI members that have consistently been coming to our events, we know is one of the major new Jim Crow forms of slavery that shuttles black people into the criminal justice system here in the U.S. and has caused present day the new Jim Crow form of slavery, with more black males being enslaved or under the claws of the criminal justice system, either on parole, under correction, or in jail, than were enslaved in 1850. And another panelist that we have is William Norris, who is Ramon Labanino's attorney. And Ramon Labanino is actually one of the Cuban Five. He is famous for his work specifically on both defending Ramon, but also talking about the journalists and the public media perception that has been swayed against the Cuban Five, since these journalists were paid by the government and to try to set up the Cuban Five and basically keep them in prison for over a decade. And lastly, we have Brother Glen Ford, who is the chief editor of Black Agenda Report. And for any of you that have been keeping up with Brother Solomon's Your World News, you will know that Glen Ford's news clips are repeatedly featured on that news site, since he's a very esteemed historian, a very well-read scholar that has participated in over 1,000 radio commercials, which half of him he produced. He is very outspoken against Obama and the deception that the black-faced president in office has created, even though he's done things that are far even more extreme and worse than what Bush did before him, such as created the NDAA, such as the drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, all over the world, or and the expansion of the war on drugs. So I hope that tonight we can enlighten you with some new information that you haven't heard before, and if not, at least solidify the views you already hold. And I thank you all for coming out tonight and look forward to having a successful event. So first of all, since we're talking about Cuba, I want to start off with, just talking about the general perception the average American has of Cuba when Cuba is mentioned. So oftentimes the corporate media will vilify Cuba, will vilify socialism and communism and Castro and things like that, because Cuba's success really presents a threat to the way things are run in the U.S. And I want to ask this first question to Brother Glen Ford. If you could tell us kind of the real story behind Cuba, U.S.-Cuba relations, and why the media might have a specific interest in vilifying Cuba and its leaders.
Well, the media has whatever interest Wall Street has. All of the media corporations are intimately connected with Wall Street. In fact, at this stage in capitalist development or devolution, Wall Street has monetized, has financialized all of the corporations, and the media corporations are no different. So when you listen to or watch a corporate media institution, you're really looking not just into the bowels of a corporation, but you're hearing the mind of Wall Street. Now, one of the things that gets on my nerves constantly, and this is the bone that I pick with people who call themselves part of the left, is whenever the word Guantanamo comes up, we'll hear the whole spectrum of the left demanding that the United States close down the prison on Guantanamo, which of course is a righteous demand. But virtually never hear a demand that the United States get the hell out of Guantanamo. The United States, that's Cuban soil, and the United States has no right to be there. And the treaty under which it operates was extracted under coercion, superpower to small power, and therefore has no moral and many people believe no legal value. But I want to talk about how Americans, that is white Americans, historically have viewed Cuba. There have been strong forces in the United States throughout U.S. history that have desired nothing less than to annex Cuba. They have even come up with theories that somehow the soil of Cuba is connected to the soil that runs through the Mississippi River and then into the Caribbean, and therefore the soil of Cuba belongs to the United States. And at one time, the strongest voices for annexing Cuba, just taking it over, were, of course, the Southern slaveocracy. That was before emancipation. And they saw Cuba as another place to expand their slave empire. It's very interesting, however, that after emancipation in the United States, that whole thing turned around. And the strongest voices against annexing Cuba were these same white voices from the South, because Cuba was just too damn black, and they didn't want to bring another largely black territory into the bounds of the United States, since they could not enslave those blacks. Similar arguments were made against annexing the Philippines, and even the same arguments against annexing Puerto Rico. When the United States invaded Cuba under the pretext of helping free it from Spain, at that point in time, the Cubans had just about accomplished their own liberation. The Americans landed in Oriente, in the eastern part of Cuba, which is the heartland of the black population, because it was the center of plantation slave-produced crops. And the American top military brass were appalled because they saw there on the beach the Cuban revolutionaries, the Cuban independence fighters, and they were largely black. And that had a real, according to reports at the time, a big emotional impact on the Americans, especially the officers, that this Cuban aspiration for independence needed to be nipped in the bud, curbed, put under control, because this revolution, from their standpoint, this independence struggle, seemed to be a black thing. And that has colored, and I'm not trying to make a pun, colored U.S. attitudes towards Cuba ever since. I think that if we leave the racial aspect of Cuba out of the equation, and sometimes Cubans don't want to feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about it, but I think that one will fail to understand the United States' historical attitude towards the independence aspirations of the people of that country, and certainly would fail to understand why the United States feels that it has some kind of God-given manifest destiny right to remain on the soil of Cuba in Guantanamo.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. I appreciate that. My next question, just to kind of introduce the issue of the Cuban Five, is to Brother William Norris. And after this brief announcement from Brother Sankara, if you could tell us who the Cuban Five are and what their story is. So, but before you do, Sankar, I believe you have a quick announcement.
Yeah, not so much an announcement, just an acknowledgement to our guests who just walked in from the Cuban intersection, and also a special acknowledgement for, I guess you could say, one of our guests of honor, Ms. Patricia Atego. Está ahí, atrás. Thank you. So, yeah, so we can continue. If you could answer that question for us.
My name is Bill Norris. I represent Ramon Lavanino. And Ramon Lavanino is the gentleman in the center of that poster with the spectacular mustache, which he has since shaved off. And actually, he's a much handsomer gentleman than that portrait would suggest. He is one of what is referred to as the Five, or the Cuban Five. And he and his four brothers are a microcosm of a really remarkable thing that's going on in this country, and with the historical sweep that's been introduced, the strange attitudes that we have had in the United States about Cuba, certainly they continue. I spoke early on in my representation of Ramon with a member of Congress from Massachusetts by the name of John Joseph Moakley. And Moakley had just announced that he was retiring from Congress. And I went to him to see if, because I knew his attitudes were fairly open to Cuba, if he would be willing to work to help do something about the attitudes in the United States. And he said yes, that he really wanted to, but he didn't have the time. And it turned out that he had retired because he had pancreatic cancer and died very shortly thereafter. That was 12 years ago, and I don't know that attitudes in the country have advanced very much further. Certainly the Five are a good place to begin, because this group of men, who all of whom I've come to know quite well, represent the very best and the very brightest of the Cuban population. They're remarkable guys, and they're committed to the social justice that they see has come to Cuba. And they came to the United States and it relates to what we'll probably hear today about Posada Carrillas. We think of, to the extent that people in the United States think about Cuba at all, which isn't much, their ideas are unformed, and they don't realize that not only is Cuba a country that's occupied by the United States, that Cuba is a country which is a victim of some pretty outrageous political acts undertaken by American citizens. They were blowing up hotels in the mid and latter part of the 1990s in an attempt to discourage European tourists from going to visit Havana. And they succeeded in killing an Italian fellow. But you never read anything about that in the press. One of the heroes from my hometown, a fellow who made his name based on going out and flying around looking for rafters, is very proud of the fact that he had a 105mm cannon mounted on a boat and was shooting at a Cuban waterfront hotel. He did that. He justified that as a political act because he said there were Soviet soldiers in the hotel. But I can assure you, all of you, without a moment's hesitation, that if somebody, for any reason at all, started lobbing 105mm shells into waterfront hotels at Miami Beach, the outrage in this country would be enormous. The Five and the Cuban government tried to deal with this problem through proper channels, dealing with the FBI. It didn't work. The Five were collecting information. They were doing what is called open source intelligence, which means reading the newspaper and talking to people. They didn't have a single classified document, although every piece of paper in their laptops was classified secret, including reprints of articles from the Miami Herald. And that was all given to the jury, right, with a secret stamp on the top. They were prosecuted for conspiracy, not that they had ever done it, mind you, but conspiracy, basically, to commit espionage. And one of them was prosecuted for conspiracy to murder 4 people who were shot down by the Cuban Air Force. One of the issues is where they were. What's not an issue at all is what they were trying to do, which they had been embarked in overflights of Havana, which is tremendously dangerous. And again, I can assure you that if 4 guys from Cuba came up in Cessna 337 push-pulls and tried to buzz the White House, they'd never get as far as the Potomac, right? We'd shoot them down. But that's basically what the case is. For me, it's been a long time of involvement with it. The detail has been tremendous. It's my first exposure in something which I, even as slow as I am on the uptake, recognize to be a political trial. It was political in its inception. Obviously, people who are engaged in high-level espionage and get into the very secrets in the Pentagon, these people are taken to jail and they throw away the key. But as I said before, these guys never had a single classified document, and there was no indication that they really were ever trying. What they were trying to do was deal with finding out who was shipping explosives down to Havana to blow up hotels, which in most of the world would all applaud that act. Not in Miami. Miami's different. Miami has a community that views with great suspicion. That's an understatement, isn't it? Anything at all associated with the government in Cuba. And it doesn't take very much to convict a guy who's accused of being an employee, basically, of the Cuban government, who admits that he is, because that's what he is. He's an employee. But what's he doing? He's trying to keep his hotels from getting blown up. He's trying to protect his wife, his daughters. The history of the case, how do you capsulize roughly 14 years of litigation? The first panel, they got convicted after 7 months of trial in Miami. We appealed to the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, Georgia, and the first 3 people out of the box said this was a perfect storm. That was the expression they used. That the forces of nature came together to guarantee a situation where these guys, who probably shouldn't have been indicted in the first place, okay? I mean, if they had been Russians, they would have been sent back to Russia. But they weren't. They were Cubans. So instead of sending them back to Cuba, they got indicted. And then they got tried in Miami. And there is, in legal jurisprudence, maybe some of you guys pass out with boredom, there are cases that talk about pervasive community prejudice. And those cases basically came out of the civil rights movement in the South. The idea being that if you're associated with people who are trying to do the wrong thing in the eyes of the majority, from a political point of view, you just can't get a fair trial in that town. The case got to be moved. And nothing could be more true of the case of the 5 in Miami, Florida, because I'm not Cuban. I don't have a drop of Cuban blood in me. I've lived in Miami for 35 years, and I had absorbed by osmosis the repeated conviction of my friends and my neighbors about what Cuba was. I had the good fortune to be in Cuba many, many times and learned it's just simply not true. But that's gospel in Miami. The panel said, perfect storm, didn't get a fair trial, go back and try it again. And then political correctness stepped in, and the majority, well, the en banc, all of the guys on the 11th Circuit sitting together, got together and said, well, the judge did a great job eliminating prejudice from the jury, which is like saying that they no longer had toenails, okay? They do have toenails, and they do grow. The only good news that I can share with you in the case of the 5 is we have learned that the perfect storm was even better than that first panel believed, because we've learned a lot of stuff that we didn't know 10 years ago. We've learned that through the Office of Cuban Broadcasting, which was set up to disperse government propaganda to affect regime change in Cuba, spending somewhere between $35 and $40 million of your money a year to do it, has been affecting community attitudes in Miami, which is a clear violation of their charter. You might say, well, it's just preaching to the choir, but we have a situation where we have 5 guys who spent 7 months in trial in a community where the government, the same government that was prosecuting them, okay, same folk, same government that was prosecuting them, was also spending about $35 million a year propagandizing the very community in which the jury was selected and for which the jury spoke. And if any of you can say that's not a violation of your right to a fair trial, your right to due process, then we ought to send you off to law school somewhere. That, you know, there are other very distinguished folk here who have a lot to say, but that in a nutshell is my response to your question.
Thank you very much. And okay, so this next question is going to be directed to Mr. Pertierra. But before we do that, I was just informed that we have another guest that we'd like to give special recognition to, and that is the Deputy Chief of Cuban Interest Section, Mr. Juan Lamiguier. I hope I'm saying your name right. But yeah, just if we could just give a round of applause for coming out. And as we continue, there are a couple of names that the audience should try to get familiar with as it pertains to the Cuban Five. The most obvious being the Cuban Five themselves. And if you guys would like some more information or like to know how you could get more informed as to the details concerning the case, our brothers back here have a wealth of reading material, some of which I've actually bought myself. So, moving on. So, in addition to those names, you also have one of the more nefarious kind of figures, if you will, in this story, and that is the name of Luis Posada. So, this question, as I said before, is directed to Mr. Jose Pertierra. So, could you tell us what his role is as it pertains to the Cuban Five and some of the work that you've been doing in terms of bringing this man to justice?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel, and I want to thank you for bringing the Cuban baseball team to Baltimore years ago. It was a tremendous game. We will be forever in your debt. I was there. I saw the game. I represent the government of Venezuela in its efforts to extradite Luis Posada Garrigues. You know, if you want to understand Cuba-U.S. relations since the beginning of the revolution, if you want to understand the Cuban Five case, you have to start with hatred and terror. The hatred and terror that spawned this terrorist, Luis Posada Garrigues, who is the Osama bin Laden of Latin America. I'm not going to give you his whole curriculum of terror. We'll be here all night. But I can tell you a couple of things that he's responsible for. In 1976, he was our man in Caracas. He was sent to Caracas by the Central Intelligence Agency. That's not something Venezuela just says or Cuba says. That's something Posada Garrigues admits, and that his lawyer admits, and has filed papers in federal district court confirming it, and the CIA itself has issued documents confirming that he was their man in Latin America. As our man in Caracas, he became head of special operations, special ops, for the Venezuelan Secret Intelligence Agency. He was in charge of finding, torturing, and murdering counterinsurgency forces in Venezuela. He planned one of the most horrific acts of terror, and certainly the worst act of international terrorism against a civilian aircraft until the horror of 9/11. Posada Carriles and his cohort, Orlando Bosch, both Cubans, conspired with two Venezuelans, Hernan Ricardo and Freddy Lugo, to blow up a civilian aircraft with 73 people on board, including 24 members of the youth fencing team of Cuba. The youth fencing team of Cuba had gone to the Pan American Games in Caracas and swept all of the medals. All of the gold, silver, and bronze medals went to the Cubans. Witnesses who saw them board the aircraft say that they were wearing their medals and went on board singing songs. They're very happy about this victory. Little did they know that on the aircraft were two Venezuelans who were busy placing bombs that would later kill them. One Venezuelan, Hernan Ricardo, placed a bomb inside a camera underneath his seat. He then placed another bomb inside a tube of Colgate toothpaste in the rear bathroom of the plane. The bombs were C4 explosives. You all know that C4 explosives you don't buy at the hardware store. It's something governments have. Plastic explosives. The two terrorists got off the plane in Barbados, and after they left the plane took off again on its way to Cuba. A few minutes after takeoff, the first bomb blew up. It blew up underneath the seat that Hernan Ricardo had vacated, but which unfortunately was being occupied by a little 9-year-old girl from Guyana, a little girl named Sabrina, and it tore her apart, killed her instantly, and blew smoke all over the cabin. We know this because we have the cockpit recordings, and we know what the pilot and the co-pilot were saying. They were complaining about the explosion on board and also the smoke. They managed to close the cabin door and turn the plane around towards Sewell International Airport in Barbados. But only a few minutes later, the second bomb exploded in the rear bathroom of the plane, thereby incapacitating the navigational features of the plane. And no matter how hard the pilot tried, he couldn't stabilize the plane, and it went down in a bay called Deepwater Bay, only yards in front of a beach, ironically enough, called Paradise, in front of the beachgoers who were there. I interviewed a man in Barbados who was the first man on the scene. He had been water skiing, and he says when he arrived on the scene, he saw headless torsos, he saw pieces of body all over the waters, along with gasoline and luggage and so forth. The two people who placed the bombs on the plane, the two Venezuelans, Ricardo and Lugo, fled to Trinidad that same day. But they were arrested in Trinidad because they had boarded this plane and gotten off in Barbados and then mysteriously immediately went back to Trinidad. Police were suspicious. And they interrogated these guys. Under interrogation, they confessed. They said that Posada Carriles had trained them, and the CIA had trained them in the use of explosives. They said that, one of them, Freddy Lugo, said that Hernan Ricardo talked to him immediately after the plane went down and said, "I have never killed so many people before. I've killed more people than Carlos el Chacal, Carlos el Jaco, who was a Venezuelan, same as they were." They drew a diagram of the detonator of the bomb for the police. We have it in his own writing. They drew the political and military structure of the terrorist organization that Posada Carriles formed to carry out that act of terrorism and several other acts of terrorism. They called Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch in Caracas and told them the bus has crashed and the dogs are dead, which was what they had agreed upon would be the code to say that the plane had crashed. Days before the downing of the plane, the CIA cabled Langley, saying that Posada Carriles had told them in Caracas, we're going to hit a Cuban airliner and Orlando pushes all the details. But no, the CIA, the FBI, nobody contacted Cuba or Venezuela about this. These men were tried in Caracas. Lugo and Ricardo were extradited to Caracas from Trinidad, because that's where the conspiracy took place, and all the countries who were involved agreed that Venezuela would be the place where the case should be tried. Hernan Ricardo and Freddy Lugo were convicted and given 20 years. They served 16. Freddy Lugo is now free and driving a taxi in Caracas. Hernan Ricardo is free and is working, according to the Miami Herald, undercover for the Drug Enforcement Administration in southern Florida. Luis Posada Carriles was not convicted because he fled. He escaped from prison. He tried 3 times, but on the 3rd time was a charm. He managed to escape. 2 weeks later, he got a job. All of you have gotten jobs. You know how difficult it is. You got to get references. You got to call. Your boss has to check you out before you're given a job, even if your job is at the 7-Eleven. Well, Posada Carriles managed to get a job as an international fugitive from justice, wanted for 73 counts of first-degree murder, and he got a job working for the CIA in an operation that later became known as a scandal called Iran-Contra in San Salvador. He was earning over $100,000 a year until the thing blew up in everybody's face, and then he went underground. He went underground to train Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and Honduran death squads. He became the national security advisor for President Vinicio Cerezo Arevalo in Guatemala. He then decided that he was really tired of training death squads in Central Americans to kill other Central Americans. What he really wanted to do was kill Cubans. So he organized a campaign of terror in the mid-90s. That was a terrible time in Cuba. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Eastern European countries as well. They were Cuba's natural trading partner. And the Cuban economy went to hell in a handbasket. And Cuba was trying desperately to get dollars. And the best way they knew to get dollars was through tourism. So the thinking by Posada Carriles and his buddies was, if we can blow up a bunch of hotels and restaurants, people will think twice about going to Cuba. So they not only planned and set bombs in Cuba, they set bombs at the most historic, emblematic of Cuban hotels and restaurants. At the Hotel Nacional, at the Bodeguita del Medio, at the Meliacoiba, at the Tropicana. The places that anybody who's been to Cuba has gone to. They're the most famous places in Cuba. He was getting the money from New Jersey. They were wiring him the money in Central America. And with that money, he was hiring Central Americans to actually take the bombs to Cuba and set them off. We know all this because the FBI has tracked the money. And the FBI has testified in federal district court. A man named Omar Vega, an agent in charge of the Posada Carriles case, testified that that money was coming from certain Cuban exiles. He named them, first name, last name, and we know where the money went. We know that Posada Carriles received it, and we know who he hired, because some of the people that he hired are today in jail in Cuba and have confessed their links to Posada Carriles and Posada Carriles' helpers. So this is all well known. Well, one of those bombs that Posada Carriles set off in Cuba, he set it off in a hotel called Hotel Copacabana. And there was an Italian businessman there who has been having coffee with 2 friends. And just as Fabio Licelmo, which was his name, got up to grab his wallet to pay the bill, the bomb blew up. It had been hidden in an ashtray near the bar. Shrapnel from the bomb cut his jugular, and Fabio died before he hit the ground. When asked about it in an interview in 1998 by the New York Times, Posada Carriles said the Italian was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that he sleeps like a baby. He being Posada Carriles. No remorse whatsoever. It was to prevent acts like this that Cuba sent some brave men to the United States to infiltrate the terrorist organizations that were engaging in this campaign of terror. And they collected the evidence, as Bill Norris said, and Cuba sent a message. Really, they sent Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize for Literature, to Washington to meet President Clinton. He never got to Clinton. He got to Mac McLarty, then Chief of Staff to Clinton. And he gave Mike McLarty a handwritten letter by Fidel telling Clinton that Cuba had evidence about terrorist acts that were being organized in the United States against Cuba, and that the United States might want to look at that evidence and actually prosecute the terrorists. The FBI went to Cuba. They received the evidence, and Cuba waited for the terrorists to be arrested. But instead of arresting the terrorists, the FBI arrested the Cuban Five and prosecuted them in Miami, of all places. Miami is a place where Santa Claus would be convicted if Santa Claus was in favor of normal relations with Cuba. And Posada Carriles continued on. Nothing happened to him until 2000. When in the year 2000 he tried to blow up an auditorium full of students at the University of Panama because Fidel Castro happened to be scheduled to speak there. 100 pounds of C4 were confiscated. He was convicted, and while he was in jail, he only served 4 years. He was pardoned illegally by the president of Panama, a woman named Moscoso. Later, the Supreme Court of Panama overturned the pardon, saying it was unconstitutional. But Posada, he didn't want to stay in Panama, he didn't want to stay in Honduras, he didn't want to stay in El Salvador. He wanted to go to the haven of terrorism, Miami. And that's what he did in 2005 aboard a yacht called the Santrina. He landed in Miami, called a bizarre press conference in Miami, embarrassed the Department of Homeland Security, then arrested him on immigration violations. We then filed an extradition request. We asked for his extradition based on a 1922 treaty between Venezuela and the United States. Murder is number one on the list of extraditable offenses. We also based ourselves on the Montreal Convention on International Aviation, which obligates the country where the terrorist is found to prosecute him in that country if they don't extradite. Prosecute him in the United States as if the crime had occurred here. The United States is engaged in a double standard when it comes to the war on terrorism. They prosecute the five who are not terrorists but anti-terrorists. And they protect people like Posada Carriles. They conduct this war on terrorism a la carte. They choose which terrorists to prosecute and which terrorists to protect. And by definition, the war on terrorism cannot be fought a la carte. They have violated the extradition treaty between Venezuela and the United States. They violated international treaties against terrorism. They violated the United States Resolution 1373, which was approved on 9/11/2001, precisely to condemn countries that protect terrorists. And what the United States did is they prosecuted Posada Carriles, all right? They prosecuted him for lying on an immigration form. They prosecuted him in El Paso, Texas. They couldn't even get a conviction for him lying on an immigration form. As this has been going on and we continue to press for his extradition, the five continue to be locked up. There are many problems, and Mr. Norris can go through the many problems of the Cuban Five case, but the essence of the problem he alluded to very correctly was the venue. You cannot have a fair trial on anything involving Cuba in Miami. A year after the Cuban Five were convicted in Miami, the United States government asked for a change of venue on a civil case involving discrimination because it touched on the issue of Cuba. And they said in court documents, you cannot have a fair trial on anything relating to Cuba in the city of Miami. That's a matter of public record, and it's true. And if you look at the allocutions that were made by the Cuban Five when they were sentenced, you see references there to what I'm talking about. Mr. Norris's client, Ramon Lavanino, said, we know that efforts were made to ensure an impartial trial, But the city of Miami is not a place where goals like these can be achieved when it comes to Cuba. Perhaps that was the most critical error in our case, holding the trial in this city. Ramon got 1 life sentence plus 18 years. And they thought, well, that's too long, said the Court of Appeals. Let's reverse that, send the case back to the judge, who then gave him only 30 years, which is what he served. Tony Guerrero said, Miami is an impossible place for justice. This has been a political trial. Tony got 1 life sentence plus 10 years. Years later, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit reversed that and thought it was excessive and reduced it to only 21 years and 10 months. He's still serving time for that. Gerardo Hernandez. Gerardo says, I want the gentlemen of the prosecution to know that the only blood there may be on these hands is the blood of my brothers and sisters who have fallen or been cowardly murdered in the countless acts of aggression and terrorism perpetrated against my country by individuals who freely walk the streets of this city, namely Miami, today. Gerardo got 2 life sentences plus 15 years. They were not reduced. He is serving 2 life sentences plus 15 years. Fernando Gonzalez said, I sincerely trust that one day Cuba will have no need for people like me to come to this country voluntarily and out of love for their country and their people to fight against terrorism. Fernando got 19 years, then they reduced it later to 17 years and 9 months. And Rene Gonzalez. Rene got 15 years, he did 13, but they won't let him leave. He did the 13, they released him from prison, but he's stuck in southern Florida because a judge wants him to complete probation in this country and rehabilitate himself into American society, despite the fact Rene only wants to go home to his wife and children. But Rene said something very interesting at his sentencing, because he spoke to the problems inherent in this country today. He says, he told the American people, cling to the real and genuine values that inspired the founding fathers of this nation. Go back to Mark Twain and forget about Rambo if you really want to leave your children a better country. And that's what this is all about. This is not just about a couple of cases, Posada, Riles, and the Cuban Five. It's really about the bedrock principles that this country supposedly was founded on. And unfortunately, there's a great deal of indifference in this country about Posada, Riles, and about the Cuban Five. I always hope that there will be sufficient indignity on the part of the American people so that the great indifference can be overcome. But so far, I've been wrong. I hope that with your help we can change that. Thank you.
I'll take your time. Thank you very much for that, Senor Jose Pertierra. And this next one is this next question is going to be directed to the gentleman to my left, my immediate left, Brian Becker. Continuing on with the same point. So we know that that your organization, the Answer Coalition, has also been doing work in effort to bring the extradition of Mr. Carillas. So if you could address the audience by telling them about your work as it pertains to the organization, and also about what are the other more bizarre aspects of this situation, that is the journalists involved and how they were, coerced to present a certain image of Carillas and the Cuban Five.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the students here for having taken the time and the interest to organize this event. There was a similar event at Howard University. We want to have events like this in campuses and high schools and communities and churches and mosques and synagogues all over the country, so that the American people learn what they presently don't know, which is a terrible injustice has taken place. In fact, it's an injustice wrapped in a larger injustice. Jose Pertierra talked about the bombing of the Cuban Airlines that took place on October 6, 1976. And all those young people, athletes and others, blown to bits by Posada Carriles, a CIA agent. And he walks free today in the streets of Miami while these men are in prison. The bombing of the Cuban Airlines, though, is just one part of what really is a 50-year-long war against Cuba. Glen Ford mentioned that the fact that the racist character of U.S. orientation towards Cuba can't be ignored, and that is certainly true. When the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, it became a beacon for oppressed people everywhere, all over the hemisphere. When Fidel and the Cuban entourage came to New York City the first time at the UN, they left their hotel on Park Avenue and went to the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, and tens of thousands of people in Harlem came out to greet the Cuban Revolution. And the interconnectedness between Cuba's revolution and the struggle for emancipation of African American people in America in the United States was close. It was bonded. And from the beginning, the U.S. has used terrorist methods to overthrow that revolution. They organized an invasion called the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. They almost incinerated Cuba and, in fact, the world in a potential thermonuclear confrontation in October 1962. You know, and I think people don't know, that more than 3,000 Cubans have died since 1959 when they had their revolution as a consequence of CIA-organized terrorism against that country. That's more people than died at the World Trade Center. And the Cuban government and the Cuban people, like any people, will resist the imposition of terrorist methods designed to stifle their own ability to exercise self-determination, to be masters of their own destiny, to be a free people. Of course, the Cuban Five are heroes in Cuba because they risked everything. They gave up their families and their jobs to go and infiltrate these terrorist organizations. And when they, as Jose explained, when they exposed that the terrorists were poised to act once again, the FBI did not arrest the terrorists, but it arrested them and gave them these long prison sentences. That was bad enough. Now, Miami was this place where the Cuban counter-revolutionaries emigrated to. Obviously, it was a hostile environment. A venue there, a venue guaranteeing equal justice and due process rights was impossible, as Bill Norris said, as the others have said. But in addition to that fact, what we have learned, the National Committee to Free the Cuban Five, Liberation newspaper, and the Partnership for Civil Justice, by filing Freedom of Information Act public records requests over and over again over the past years, we have learned that scores of so-called journalists, people who the people in Miami thought were independent reporters for the news media, for the print, for newspapers, for radio, for TV, during the entire time that the Cuban Five were on trial, were in fact paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more than $1 million, by the same government, the U.S. government, through an agency called the BBG, the Board of Broadcasting Governors. They paid these same journalists who put into the media in Miami at the time the jury was deliberating, at the time they heard the case, and at the time they were deliberating, and they weren't sequestered. They could go home, they could watch TV, they could read the newspapers, they could talk to their friends who were watching the media. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were paid to these so-called reporters to put into the media the most inflammatory, prejudicial, hostile, incendiary rhetoric against the Cuban Five so that they were convicted before the jury finished its deliberations. And you know what that's called? It's called jury tampering. and it's a criminal offense. And it's also illegal according to the U.S. law. In 1948, during the middle of the Cold War, the so-called Cold War, the U.S. government passed something called the Smith-Mundt Act, which allowed the U.S. government to use Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and all of the other government propaganda agencies to propagandize against people or with people in other countries to help them overthrow the governments that the United States had targeted for overthrow, mostly socialist governments. But that law forbade the United States from using government dollars to carry out internal domestic propaganda against the American people themselves. That's deliberately, specifically forbidden according to the 1948 Smith-Mundt Act. So when we learn through these thousands of pages of documents now, not when the trial was happening, not in 2001, but we learned these in the last few years, that the U.S. government illegally propagandized to the American people through reporters who were on the payroll of the U.S. government to prejudice the jury at the moment the jury was hearing the evidence, so-called evidence, and deliberating on the fate of the Cuban Five. And you know, sisters and brothers, the thousands of documents we've gotten, and it took years to get these documents. We got the contracts. We have the contract numbers. We have their names. We have how much money they were paid. And they were paid lots of money to carry out the government's mission to affect public opinion and specifically jury opinion. All of that information that we got, it's the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. In fact, there are thousands of more pages of documents that the U.S. government right now won't release to us. If there's nothing to hide, why not release the documents?
That's right.
But of course there's a lot to hide because they violated U.S. law. They violated the Smith-Mundt Act. They tampered with the jury. They, in spite of the fact that Miami was already such a hostile environment, they went the extra step of paying these so-called reporters to be able to write articles that are completely false about the Cuban Five. And many of these reporters, brothers and sisters, are also engaged in promoting terrorist acts themselves against the people of Cuba. We have to take the message of the Cuban Five. We have to make sure that they are not alone, that they do not sit as they have sat for all these years in these dungeons, in these U.S. prisons, without knowing that they have the affection and the solidarity and the support and the love of people all around the country, all around this country. People who say to the government of this country, you speak in our name when you imprison them. You speak in our name when you blockade Cuba. You speak in our name when you carry out CIA acts. You do this in our name, but you do it without our consent. We can only show that to be true by taking action. We hope everyone joins the movement, not just to hear the speakers, but go to the website, freethefive.org. There are petitions there. There are petitions in the back. Take the petitions and take them to your fellow students. Educate yourselves and educate them about what this means. And we know that the Cuban Five can be freed, not because the judges will make the difference, but as we know in almost all political cases, the people themselves have to become a factor in the judicial process. If the judges are there cloistered and hearing no dissent, no opposition, it's very easy for them to throw the key away. But let's let them hear the voices of hundreds of thousands of Americans who say no to the blockade of Cuba, no to this injustice, and to demand what the Cuban people are demanding, that these five be released, not tomorrow, not next year, but today, and be set free and be able to go home to their families and, of course, to their beloved country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. My next question is directed to Mr. Schmoke. And given your background and expertise in law, could you enlighten us on some of the legal aspects of the case as well as your personal take on the Cuban Five and the U.S. criminal injustice system.
If I were to try to answer all that, we'd be here all night. First of all, let me apologize to my friends who may not be fluent English speakers. No hablo español, so I'm sorry. But I will be very brief and try to just summarize some of the important issues, and particularly one of the reasons why we are here at the University of Maryland campus. I have been very pleased as the Dean of the Howard University School of Law to have two events there focusing on the plight of the Cuban Five. We felt that important because we recognize there is power among the youth, that young people using various social networks can reach a wide audience to bring education and information to the attention of a wider audience, so that there will not be this complacency, this ignorance, this acceptance of a grave injustice. The injustice to the Cuban Five is something that all of us bear as citizens of the United States. Throughout the world, great leaders, people of goodwill, have asked, why is it that the United States is prosecuting these men? And there's not been an honest answer over the last decade or more. One of the things that really strikes me when I think of this whole case is how people whom I generally respect in politics are also complicit in this. The Cuban Five were not prosecuted by right-wing Tea Party members. The person who was president when they were prosecuted was Bill Clinton. The person who had the opportunity to go to the Supreme Court to have these cases heard and have the cases overturned was Barack Obama. The Solicitor General who argued the case for the United States when it got to the Supreme Court is now on the Supreme Court, Elena Kagan. These are not people that you generally associate with far right political activity. So what is going on here? It is the strange and unfortunate legacy of U.S. relations with Cuba that are locked in almost a time capsule. You could possibly understand this if this were 1959. Possibly. You maybe could understand it if you reversed the roles, and I think it was Bill Norris that talked about it. If you put yourself in the position of if someone were attacking the United States, what would our reaction be? But in 1998, in 2013, there's no explanation other than the politics of the past, the moneyed interests that have always blocked changes in the relationship between the United States and Cuba. And the only way this is going to change is for people's voices to be raised. I found it quite ironic coming here today. I heard on the radio that two of our Congress people are now in Cuba visiting Alan Gross, who is incarcerated, a U.S. citizen there. And yet, the United States will not allow the wives of the Cuban Five to come here, alleging that, at least in one instance, the wife, they say, is a part of a terror network. or evidence suggests that she was part of a terror network. I believe very strongly that our criminal justice system has been hijacked. It has been hijacked by politics, and it is an affront to all of us who believe in a fair system, and I do believe there is a way out. President Obama, by a stroke of a pen, could release these men. He doesn't have to get involved in the case. He can simply say, time served. The Constitution gives him that power. He doesn't have to pardon and say all's forgiven. He can simply commute the sentence. He can say, I'm not going to get involved in whether you did, whether you didn't, time served, too long. This is simply a time for a fresh start. Just a stroke of a pen, he could do that. I think that it is up to us to increase the pressure, to make sure that other citizens recognize this, that understand that this is not just a problem for the Cuban Five, it is a problem for us and the operation of our criminal justice system. And I urge you to do all you can as people who are connected with friends all over the world to raise this issue and to urge the president, by the stroke of his pen, to let these men go home.
Thank you, Mr. Schmoke. Brother Glen Ford, you have a comment?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Mr. Schmoke has said. U.S. Anger at Cuba and expressed through the Cuban Five isn't just about bad memories about 1959. In a sense, the Cuban Five are hostage to U.S. anger at its defeat in South America, a defeat which they are suffering today. We have to remember that the United States, of course, has been intimidating and bullying and invading Latin America since the Monroe Doctrine. We had something called filibusterers who were actually pirates, U.S. pirates that would go down to especially Central America and try to take over countries. They would get boats and shell Haiti from the sea, just running rampant all throughout the hemisphere. So that's a constant in American history. But after 1959, the United States became obsessed with the fear of there being 1, 2, 3 more Cubas. And it got involved in a frenzy of fomenting right-wing takeovers of governments all throughout South America until we reached a point in which almost every South American nation was ruled by some kind of right-wing dictatorship. And the people of South America went through this experience collectively, contemporaneously, as a region of people. And it was a humiliating experience. It was humiliating even to folks that we would not call leftists, but who were nationalists and saw that the entire region was being humiliated by the United States in its obsession to prevent more Cubas. This created a kind of collective revulsion and determination in the region not to come under the heel of the United States anymore. And this was widespread. It in fact was a feeling that existed across much of the political spectrum. So now we see a South America almost unique in the world that does not collaborate with the U.S. war on terror. A South America in which most of its people live under what we would call left leftist regimes, and not just in Bolivia and Ecuador and, of course, Venezuela and Brazil and Argentina. There is a consensus now in South America against what was called in the past the Washington Consensus, which was the edict from Washington, and you will toe Washington's line. And it's not a passive South American consensus. It is an active one that actively tries to organize the nations of the region in ways that they will never again be under the U.S. boot. And so the United States, which right across the Atlantic Ocean in Africa has subverted the African Union to be almost an annex of AFRICOM, has promulgated an international criminal court that it does not even belong to, that only indicts Africans, that has put into full force its bogus doctrine of humanitarian military intervention. It is inconceivable that the United States can do that in South America. And that is largely because of the example of Cuba in Latin America. Cuba, which was still standing and defiant of U.S. imperialism while most of the continent was under the boot of the most vile dictators. Cuba did not create on its own this independence from U.S. imperialism that we see in South America. But without Cuba's existence as a free and socialist country, certainly that development would have occurred in very, very different ways. So the U.S. is still angry, and it's not just about 1959. It's about 2013.
That's right. Let me just make a brief comment. First of all, I want to apologize because I have to leave. I have another commitment. But I want to make one brief comment following up what Mr. Schmoke said about executive clemency and the commutation of sentences. History is always a guide. Back during the First World War, dozens of people were convicted under the Espionage Act and given long prison sentences. Religious activists, trade unionists, pacifists. After the war was over, President Wilson commuted most of those sentences. But what was curious was a New York Times article that quoted the Department of Justice spokesman explaining why President Wilson was commuting the sentences. He says, you see, these men and women were sentenced during a time of war when passions were heightened, and they got disproportionately long sentences as a result. The war is now over, and it's time to put that behind us. And I think we can use those words today to apply to Cuba. Cuba and the United States have been in a kind of war since the beginning of the revolution. It's time to put that behind us, move forward, commute the sentences of the 5, return Alan Gross, and let's move on with life. And I gotta go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pertierra. Next, I want to invite Brother Kamal to say a few words about the Cuban medical program. And just to kind of give some background on that, Brother Glen Ford already outlined how Cuba has a history of being an internationalist country, involved with so many liberation struggles, specifically throughout the African continent, for example, in Angola, and has sent troops, over 300,000 troops, to foreign countries to help their liberation struggles and free them from colonialism, as well as thousands and thousands of doctors, which Cuba actually also sent to the U.S. in the aftermath of Katrina. But when Bush was in office, Bush rejected Cuba from sending those doctors to help those that were affected from Hurricane Katrina. And that just goes to show, what type of politics are at play here in the United States. and how Cuba, even though the U.S. imposes an embargo on the country, still offered to help out the U.S. and was rejected from doing so. So that being said, with Cuba being that internationalist nation, the medical program, the free medical program, which specifically, as Brother Kamal will mention, favors African students living in the United States to study medicine in Cuba, is one of those examples. So, Brother Kamal, if you could quickly say some words about that, appreciate that.
Before we say anything about the Cuba medical program, we don't have the specifics now, but we can get some information through IFCO, PassesForPeace.com, and you can get more information.
You want to use the mic?
So you can
Please use the mic.
Because they're doing a videotape too.
There's a mic on the floor in the middle too, if you want to do that.
You can get more specific information about the medical program in Cuba, which we have visited. It's a beautiful hospital in Cuba, very scenic, with students who are interested and professors, students who have the prerequisite courses, etc., that would want to get information about the program. We suggest you contact IFCO or PassesForPeace.com. We are the DC Metro Coalition Free to Cuba 5. We've been in existence since 2008-9, if I can recall. We work with the National Committee to Free the Cuba 5. We are made of various organizations, from the All African People's Revolutionary Party, myself, to the Socialist Workers Party, Communist Party USA, ANSWER, and for any individuals who are interested in helping us. We give fundraisers, we organize demonstrations, etc. There's some literature on the back table if you're interested. Also, there's a list that you can sign up if you're interested. Your name, your email number, or your telephone number. And we'd be happy to work with you. We've been working with, as I said, the coalition for the last 4 or 5 years. But we are in solidarity with Cuba since the revolution. Right.
Thank you, Brother Kamal. Gentleman back there, you have a question? Please come up to the mic.
I have actually a question and a comment, if I can. Thank you.
Definitely.
I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and burned that. Man, the way that I live don't concern that. Man, we gon' have to settle this.